Today's conference, the European Day for Border Guards. This is the second time that we are meeting in Warsaw to foster the culture of guardianship in Europe based on shared principles and values. And let me speak first of all from the point of view of a citizen and pay tribute to all the men and women who are protecting Europe's borders on a daily basis. There is thousands of you out there in difficult situations, making sure that we in Europe can live safely and peacefully. And among them, there is the patron of today's conference, the Frontex agency, which in 6 years of existence has done, to my mind, an incredible job. And surely the last year has been an extremely challenging period, and they have stood up to it in such an excellent fashion. In last year, when we met to discuss the challenges of the future, we could have anticipated the eruption of the Icelandic volcano, but we would not have anticipated that a Tunisian vendor would set in motion such a momentous process of change in the Arab world. The jury is still out what's going to happen in that region, and it's really in our hands, including in the hands of people dealing with border management and migration, to make sure that the positive scenario materializes, that the Arab world joins the community of democratic and free nations. Barack Obama gave a speech on North Africa and the Middle East, which to my mind a European leader should have given. In Europe, we are too often faced with a sense of resignation about what goes on in our neighborhoods. But we can still make it the equivalent of Europe's 1989. I mean, Europe has a wonderful democratization story to tell the Arab world. It's the story of this region, which in a matter of one generation moved from the dark woods of communism to a very respectable political and economic stature. It's very much about migration policy, about border management, to ensure that this transition is successful. And I'm extremely pleased that these are the issues which we will discuss during the opening session. But to give us the political guidance, I would like to ask first the Deputy Minister of Interior of Poland, Mr. Zbigniew Sosnowski, to tell us what are, in his view, the main challenges for Europe's migration and asylum policy, and how will the incoming Polish presidency deal with these issues. Minister Sosnowski, the floor is yours. The minister will speak in Polish, so if you could reach out for your headphones, please.
Szanowny Panie Dyrektorze, Szanowni Państwo Ministrowie, dostojni goście, Szanowni Państwo, w imieniu Ministra Spraw Wewnętrznych i Administracji, Pana Jerzego Millera i własnym, pragnę bardzo gorąco podziękować za zaproszenie na to dzisiejsze seminarium. Niestety, ze względu na bardzo ważne obowiązki, Pan Minister nie może być razem z nami, stąd tylko moja obecność. Zabierając głos w imieniu Pana Ministra, pragnę podziękować Panu Dyrektorowi, generałowi Ilce Laitinenowi za zorganizowanie dzisiejszego seminarium i chcę wyrazić ogromną radość, że siedziba Frontexu mieści się w Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej. To dla nas wielka radość, ale w tym miejscu pragnę zapewnić Pana Dyrektora o naszej ogromnej życzliwości i chęci dalszej współpracy. Pozwólcie Państwo, że w imieniu Ministra Spraw Wewnętrznych i Administracji Pana Jerzego Millera pozwolę sobie przedstawić Państwu sposób, w jaki rząd polski postrzega aktualną sytuację migracyjną związaną z napływem migrantów z Afryki Północnej. Niedawne wydarzenia w Afryce Północnej i na Bliskim Wschodzie niewątpliwie stanowią niecodzienne wyzwanie dla polityki migracyjnej i azylowej Unii Europejskiej. Polityki, co warto podkreślić, która niezależnie od zaistniałej sytuacji międzynarodowej wciąż znajduje się w fazie kształtowania i sama w sobie podlega dynamicznym zmianom. Choć tempo rozwoju polityk Unii Europejskiej dotyczących kontroli granicznych, azylu i migracji było w ostatniej dekadzie imponujące, to nie pozostawia wątpliwości fakt, że dotychczasowe unijne ramy polityczne i prawne nie wystarczają do zapewnienia odpowiedniej i szybkiej reakcji Unii Europejskiej na sytuacje kryzysowe, w tym tę, z którą aktualnie mamy do czynienia, a która bezdyskusyjnie stanowi katalizator do poszukiwania rozwiązań pozwalających na skoordynowaną, skuteczną odpowiedź Unii Europejskiej na sytuacje nadzwyczajne. Czy w obecnej sytuacji mamy do czynienia z wewnątrzunijnym kryzysem migracyjnym? Czy natężenie zjawisk migracyjnych do Unii Europejskiej uzasadnia postulaty sięgania do rozwiązań nadzwyczajnych? Biorąc pod uwagę dane statystyczne, zaledwie kilkadziesiąt tysięcy imigrantów, które w ostatnich miesiącach przedostały się nielegalnie na terytorium kilku państw członkowskich Unii Europejskiej, w porównaniu do ponad kilkuset tysięcy osób, które w wyniku konfliktu zbrojnego uciekły z terytorium Libii do krajów sąsiednich, to jest do Egiptu i Tunezji, nie wydaje się, by skala problemu w Unii Europejskiej mogła zagrażać fundamentom przyjętych polityk. A jednak te przepływy migracyjne wywołały w Unii Europejskiej kryzys natury politycznej, u podstaw którego leży niepełna solidarność państw członkowskich Unii Europejskiej z państwami narażonymi na wzmożony napływ imigrantów. Warto zaznaczyć, że jednym z praktycznych wymiarów solidarności wewnątrzeuropejskiej były sprawnie zorganizowane, przeprowadzone we współpracy z szeregiem państw członkowskich, wspólne operacje Fronteksu, do których gotowa jest włączyć się m.in. Polska. Tym, czego Unii Europejskiej pilnie potrzeba, to rozwiązania tak prawne, jak i organizacyjne oraz finansowe odnoszące się do sytuacji nadzwyczajnych, a także wcielające w życie traktatową zasadę solidarności i sprawiedliwego podziału odpowiedzialności między państwami członkowskimi. Należy nadać priorytet usprawnianiu i racjonalizacji mechanizmów funkcjonujących w strefie Schengen, aby skutecznie odpowiadać na sytuacje kryzysowe w polityce azylowej, tak by decyzje poszczególnych państw członkowskich nie wywołały efektu domina. Zasadne wydaje się również wprowadzenie zmian organizacyjnych umożliwiających pełniejsze wykorzystanie potencjału agencji unijnych, a w szczególności Fronteksu, Europolu i EASO. Niezależnie od okoliczności zewnętrznych i sytuacji kryzysowych, zniesienie kontroli na granicach wewnętrznych jest fundamentem funkcjonowania strefy Schengen. Konieczne jest zatem wzmocnienie systemu zarządzania strefą Schengen poprzez egzekwowanie zobowiązań państw członkowskich w celu zapobiegania nieprzestrzegania bądź niewdrażania we właściwy sposób acquis Schengen, a także wzmacnianie mechanizmów wzajemnych gwarancji bezpieczeństwa. Pozwoli to na utrzymanie zaufania między państwami członkowskimi. Zaufania, które buduje się latami, a które można utracić jedną niewłaściwą decyzją. Celem prezydencji polskiej będzie nadanie propozycjom w tym zakresie skutecznego charakteru przy pełnym zachowaniu proporcjonalności wobec skali i rodzaju zagrożeń. Prawdziwa solidarność jest jednak pilnie potrzebna krajom sąsiadującym z Unią Europejską, które w obecnej sytuacji wzięły na siebie znaczący ciężar ruchów migracyjnych z Libii. Pomoc tym krajom to także inwestycja w solidarność wewnątrzunijną. Trzeba nam ponadto skutecznych, wielowymiarowych rozwiązań nie tylko jako reakcja na już powstałą sytuację kryzysową, ale także jako element przemyślanej, długoterminowej strategii prewencji, polegającej na budowaniu i wzmacnianiu zdolności krajów sąsiedzkich do zarządzania ruchami migracyjnymi, a także opartej na rozwoju dobrosąsiedzkich stosunków z tymi krajami. W tym kontekście należy zapewnić podejmowanie działań zarówno na rzecz krajów sąsiadujących z Unią Europejską od południa, ale także od wschodu. Zdaję sobie sprawę, że Polska jako kraj jest znajdujący się w bezpośredniej bliskości geograficznej z regionem aktualnie dużej niestabilności politycznej i znaczącym potencjale demograficznym, nie posiadający istotnego odsetka populacji obcokrajowców na swoim terytorium, ani bliskich związków językowych czy kulturowych z krajami Afryki Północnej i Bliskiego Wschodu. Nie musi się czuć bardzo zagrożona skutkami rozważanych wydarzeń. Jednak minister spraw wewnętrznych i administracji, pan Jerzy Miller, wyrażał i potwierdza także dziś gotowość aktywnego wsparcia państw znajdujących się w trudnej sytuacji, zarówno przy wykorzystaniu funkcjonujących instrumentów prawno-organizacyjnych, w tym przede wszystkim poprzez zaangażowanie w działania Fronteksu, jak i na zasadzie dobrowolności, poprzez możliwość przyjęcia grupy osób wymagających ochrony międzynarodowej z innego państwa członkowskiego. W ramach sprawowania prezydencji w Radzie Unii Europejskiej w najbliższych miesiącach pan minister będzie dążył do wprowadzenia zmian na rzecz wzmocnienia strefy Schengen, pogłębienia stopnia integracji w odniesieniu do polityki migracyjnej i azylowej, w tym w szczególności wyposażenia Unii Europejskiej w odpowiednie instrumenty do rozwiązywania sytuacji kryzysowych, a także w przypadku dalszego rozwoju sytuacji w Libii pan minister będzie sprzyjał wprowadzaniu w życie przejawów solidarności przy wykorzystaniu dostępnych instrumentów unijnych, a także współpracy międzynarodowej. Dziękuję za uwagę.
Thank you very much, Minister, for this extremely strong message of reassurance, in fact, that the foundations are safe and well protected. The Minister did stress the importance of increase of trust and also of helping countries in the neighborhood south and east, and spoke about those challenges in the context of the forthcoming Polish presidency. So thank you very much for that. I would like to invite the panelists now, and they are Madeleine Garlick, who is Head of Units, Policy and Legal Support at the UN High Commissioner's European Office, Irena Vojáčková-Sollorano, who is Director of the Department for Migration Management at the International Organization for Migration. Welcome. Peter Wiedermann, who is Director General at the International Center for Migration Development. Welcome. Belinda Pike, who is Director for Migration and Borders, DG Home Affairs at the European Commission. Agostino Miozzo, who is Managing Director of the Crisis Response and Operational Coordination at the European External Action Service in Brussels. And finally, Ilkka Laitinen, Executive Director of Frontex. And I'll move over to join the panelists. I hope you can see us. We have just over an hour for a discussion about the challenges of North Africa and the Middle East. And the way I would like to run our discussion is to ask each panelist a set of questions about both what's going on and about the policy response. After that, I will open up for questions and comments. So please, if you have your reflections, do share them with us. And let me start with the picture of the situation on the ground, so to say. Madeleine Garlick, you are involved hands-on in the area. Can you tell us what the trends are, and particularly how would you differentiate the different groups of people who are moving across borders? Those who require international protection, those who migrate for economic reasons, and how difficult has it become to differentiate between the two?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also to the organisers of today's event, notably Frontex, for the opportunity to take part. Today's panel discussion has the heading of Evolving Transition Processes, Opportunities for the European and International Communities. And I hope we will have a chance to really talk about the opportunities, because there are indeed, I think, some very valuable chances here for Europe in particular to support some very positive developments towards openness and more transparent and democratic forms of governments in the Middle East and North Africa. But what we see immediately today, I think very much, are a number of very serious challenges with regards to a massive displacement of people forced to move as a result of the events we've had. Most notably, of course, and most dramatically, we see the situation that has resulted from the conflict of Libya. According to UNHCR's figures, as of the 22nd of May, we have now seen a total of some 850,000 people who have fled Libya. This includes the majority of whom, 430,000, who have gone to Tunisia, and almost 300,000 to neighbouring country of Egypt. There are also other countries that have received these displaced people, including Algeria, Chad, Sudan, and others in the neighbourhood. Many of these people who have been displaced have been able to return to their home countries with the help of their governments, or in some cases, with the help of IOM and UNHCR through the humanitarian evacuation that we have collectively organised with the strong support of European states, militaries, governments, and of course the Commission with its valuable financial and logistical assistance there. But what we see also is that there is a significant number of people who are still stranded in the border areas and who are living now in very difficult conditions. And it's going to pose a great challenge to care for them in the coming weeks and months as conditions continue to be challenging there. What we see as the conflict has gone on is continuing arrivals. And we see, of course, challenges that we face then in providing suitable accommodation, access to infrastructure, water, the basic standards of living for such people, security, and other means to meet their basic needs. And then, of course, there is the question then of the future of these people who are displaced in North Africa. Some of them, we hope, will ultimately be able to return to Libya once conditions allow for that. Some of them may be able to return home to their own countries, and others may find safety elsewhere. But there is a significant group there who do need protection and who, for the time being, do not have anywhere where they're going to be likely to go. Before this conflict began, UNHCR had registered some 11,000 refugees and asylum seekers, people who had come from countries including Somalia, Sudan, Eritrea, and others, who, in our definition, clearly are refugees in need of ongoing protection. Many of those people have now fled to the neighbouring countries. And even if the conflict does end in the foreseeable near future, they will still have a great question about their future and where they should be able to go, as Libya is perhaps not likely to be expected to have a functioning asylum system in the near future, even after the conflict concludes. And this is one of the reasons why UNHCR has been calling on European countries, amongst others, to look at resettlement for such people in order to try and provide long-term durable solutions for these people, as well as providing a form of clear solidarity with the countries in the region by showing its willingness to share responsibility for the aftermath of this crisis. There have also, of course, been very significant displacement movements to Europe. As of the 22nd of May, UNHCR's figures record that there are 38,000 people who have moved since January this year from North Africa to Italy. Amongst those numbers, some 24,000 have come from Tunisia, and approximately 14,000 are people who have fled from Libya, including Libyans, but other third country nationals who have also been displaced by that conflict. For UNHCR, it's very important that we acknowledge the need for a differentiated response for the different strands amongst these displacement movements. What we see is that the Tunisian people who have arrived in Italy, by and large, have not asked for protection or are not fitting the definition of a refugee according to the Geneva Convention. There are, however, amongst the third country nationals and people displaced from Libya, a significant number who clearly do have a protection need in our view, and many of those have applied for asylum and are being processed through the Italian asylum system. It's very important for us, also in the course of the general debate around this issue, as well as in terms of our own operational and policy responses, to be very clear that these are very different groups with different legal entitlements who require differentiated reactions from Europe and from the international community more generally. What I think we see from this picture also is that whilst Europe certainly has a significant challenge with the numbers of people that have arrived, it is, compared to the numbers of people who are being hosted in Tunisia and Egypt, two countries which themselves have recently experienced significant instability and are facing many challenges, that Europe's share of those who have arrived is comparatively small. Other European countries have prepared for the potential of significant movements. We have some 1,400 people who have also arrived in Malta, but otherwise there haven't been large numbers until now. Still, I think what this underlines is that it's extremely important for us to have, through opportunities in debates such as this, to look at what sort of plans we need to be making and what sort of careful, measured, and humanitarian responses that are in accordance with the rights and needs of the people who are concerned.
Thank you very much. Irena Vojáčková, International Organization for Migration, is also involved out there in the field. I mean, you are doing the daily situation reports, you are monitoring border crossings, you are finally doing evacuations of Tunisian, Egyptian, Chadian nationals. What is the gravity of the situation from your perspective?
Thank you very much. I would just not say the same thing that UNHCR said, because we are doing this operation together, and it is a crisis situation, and we are handling it as a crisis situation. That means we are focusing on getting the services to people as fast as possible, and the most important service for people now who are crossing borders is to get home. And the evacuation happens on a daily basis. Thousands of people are daily being brought home. And we have to see that brought home doesn't mean just across the border, because in Libya we had a large number of migrant workers, millions of migrant workers from all over the world. Some countries were able to assist their own nationals to bring them back home. Some did not have the capacity because of the magnitude and because of their own means. We have evacuated people back to Bangladesh, to the Philippines, to Sri Lanka, to Afghanistan, to Pakistan. So there are migrants from all over the world. But the numbers that are now growing are more the numbers of migrant workers from sub-Saharan Africa, something that does not get as much media attention as the other migrant workers. So we are in the midst of an emergency operation, and that's what we do with UNHCR. We try to assist as quick as we can. And speed is of the essence, because, as was said before, if migrants get stuck at the border and they are not assisted, we will create a situation that might lead increasingly to illegal migration, because people have to do something. They will not just sit at the border and wait. So this is the emergency operation. Looking ahead, the flow of migrants will after a while decrease, because most of them, the ones who could get out, will get out. And then we have to look at what do we do with the migrants that need protection. And this is where the refugee protection scheme is very important and needs to be taken very seriously. The flows towards Europe, as was said already before, are very minimal in comparison to the large flows that we see, to the numbers that we are evacuating, which is around 140,000 at this point of time that we have evacuated back home to all over the world. We have to look at the future, and that's the theme of this meeting. We cannot predict what will happen. We just all hope that countries will stabilize and some kind of democratic systems will fall in place. This might take a while. In the meantime, people have to survive, people have to live, and families have to have their coping mechanisms. There comes in the dialogue with Europe. Europe is the future of this region. The region will very much look towards Europe. How do we communicate? How do we cooperate? And it is not only about migration, it is mainly about economics. And, but economics is tied to migration. We have to look at the interplay between trade and migration. We have learned this in other regions already. I think we will have to learn it increasingly also for the North Africa region. Migration is a very complex issue. It is not just people moving. It is an issue that is a mix of pull and push factors, which in this region will be looking for stability. It will not be, the motivation of most of migrants will not be to get advantages. It is looking for stability. And Europe is a stable continent. So we have to think about how do we put a migration management scheme in place that satisfies the needs of Europe. We have very highly skilled people in the north of Africa. We should not forget that Libya has the highest education factor from the whole region. And how do we satisfy the needs of the European industry? How do we satisfy the needs of our demography? And how do we communicate with the future countries in that region about this? Security is important and should be always part of these discussions. But one should look at the big picture. And the big picture is to have a dialogue that takes the countries in the region seriously and to see what potential is there instead of just focusing on the strictly security angle of this, which is important and should always be part of the discussion. So this is just from the emergency where we are now, something that is happening as we speak, looking into the future where we are, as IOM, working already now with the governments in the region to help them to identify their own migration needs. And most migration happens within the region, not towards Europe. And also to work with, of course, European governments to look at how best to communicate with the region, that we get also a rational discussion and not an overly emotionalized migration debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. This was a very powerful message. Peter Wiedemann, we heard from Irena Vojáčková that there is an emergency situation at the moment, and the gravity of it is much bigger when it comes to the inner North African context than with respect to North Africa and Europe. But also we heard that the International Organization for Migration anticipates that this migratory flow will decrease because those who want to get out will get out, and that we should focus on stability as the main driver for these people rather than economic advantage. Is that also what you see in the migratory flows in the region?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Wiedemann. I'm representing ICMPD, an international organization based in Vienna, which is working and striving for migration governments, future-oriented migration governments, and working with its member states and partner states. Yes, it's my estimation as well. The core message is of the figures that the direct result of political turmoil in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya was an increase in the movement of people from one North African country to another, and in a smaller, yet visible numbers, the movement of people from the region with a view to seeking asylum or immigrant status within the EU. These movements, in my opinion, are certainly rooted in a complex set of factors which require multifaceted responses, especially in economic, political, and social reforms, of which migration policy has to form a central element. Therefore, ICMPD advocates a balanced and comprehensive European approach in addressing the emerging migration trends in the Mediterranean Arab region. Our 5-point plan of action could be summarized as follows. Firstly, we need to address the immediate humanitarian concerns, including the provision of shelter, medicine, and food supplies. And as we learned, this is obviously well managed by UNHCR and IOM. Secondly, we need to prevent the loss of life at sea. Adequate responses to the departure of irregular migrants must be presented and implemented, and the cooperation with countries in the region should be explored to this end. And here I see a major role of Frontex, whose position in this regard should be increased. Thirdly, we must anticipate an increase in the arrival of boats on European shores. Early predictions and scenarios about the possible outflow of refugees and migrants from the crisis areas had been circulated, and these predictions had obviously not been precise. Yet one element is certain. It's most likely that the influx will not exceed current capacity. However, European structures and procedures are in place to effectively address the likely developments. Fourthly, we need to revisit the Mediterranean neighborhood policy. Although it's clear that migration does not represent the sole remedy in addressing the underlying challenges in the region, it has an instrumental and positive impact in reshaping perceptions, prospects, and solutions within this emerging reality in the New South. Embedded in a revised, solid overall policy framework, migration policy will play a significant role in addressing a number of root causes. And fifth and last, we need to create synergies between migration and development. It is widely recognized that migration can have a positive impact on the development process of countries and societies. Migrants' remittances, the transfer of know-how, and the acquisition of skills, as well as new frameworks for migration partnerships, which could include circular migration and similar arrangements, contribute positively to democratic societies. Therefore, migration policies that take development issues into account must form part of the overall approach to the Mediterranean Arab region. Ladies and gentlemen, I think there's a dire need to reinforce the neighborhood policy framework, incorporating first and foremost the global approach to migration. Equally, there's an immediate prerequisite to reactivate solidarity among EU member states and to work on trustful partnerships in the South, taking into account the opportunities as well as the security aspects of migration. Effective European policy frameworks are largely in place to address the magnitude and scale of the crisis, and the means to further activate these policies must be at the top of our agenda. It's therefore our hope that the future vision will be based on a comprehensive approach, and we are committed to contribute to dialogue and action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for helping us move from the picture of the situation in the region to the policy framework with your action points. And I would like to ask Belinda Pike about the policy framework. How adequate is it, given the scale of the challenge? We heard from Irena about 140,000 evacuations which have already been carried out, about the migrants from sub-Saharan Africa who are arriving in big numbers. I mean, the one question that immediately comes to my mind is not only how adequate the policy framework is, but are we fast enough to respond to the challenge?
Thanks very much, and first of all, congratulations to Frontex for organising this event, and also it's a great pleasure to be in Poland, and when you introduced the conference, you drew attention to the big changes we've seen in Europe in the last 20 years, and I think it's very good to keep that picture in our mind as we look at what's happening in North Africa. Irena made the point that people want to come to the European continent because they see Europe now as a centre of stability, but it's not so many years ago that that was not the case. But we now have a European Union clearly built on the values of democracy and the respect for human dignity, and I think it's very important that we demonstrate those values in our relations with these countries and also in how we handle the current crisis. The key messages I think I would like to stress are, first of all, the European Union has shown that it is able to respond. We have instruments, which I'll come to in a moment, but they've shown their value, but also their limitations. That there are improvements already in the pipeline for the various instruments, which I'll describe in a moment. But of course, none of this can be effective without real political commitment, particularly from governments. We need to see real demonstration of solidarity and also a willingness to act quickly. And if I can just refer to one action which we hope we'll see a swift movement by the governments, that is the improvement of the legislative framework under which Frontex operates. The heads of state have already said that they expect to reach agreement before the end of the Hungarian presidency, and yet somehow in Brussels that really isn't being translated into the degree of urgency that we would like to see. But we very much hope there will be an agreement between the Parliament and the Council on that before the European Council meets later this month on the 23rd and 24th of June, with these issues of the Southern Mediterranean and the response very much on their agenda. Just briefly to set out the key building blocks which I think are relevant for the framework. They are essentially border management, asylum policy, immigration policy, and relations with third countries. And I don't think one can respond to crises like this without looking at all of the instruments that we have available. But perhaps I can start it, first of all, with the relations with third countries. And the point was just made about how important it is that our response is very much embedded in the more general neighbourhood policy. And indeed, it was in that context that yesterday the European Commission adopted a policy communication on a dialogue for migration, mobility and security between the European Union and the Southern Mediterranean countries. And a central component of this policy approach is mobility partnerships. And they essentially have two axes. The first is to facilitate legal migration, including looking at what are the labour market needs within the European Union. And we know that we have labour market needs, we have skills needs, which are going to grow as the demographic trends have the impact that they will on our working population. We recognise that in these countries, as has been pointed out, there are people there with the skills that we need, or they can very quickly upgrade those skills. There may be barriers to their qualifications being recognised in our member states. We need to tackle all of these issues in a broader context, look indeed at circular migration, how to support return and reintegration, how to use methods such as visa facilitation to support this process. So that's one axis, facilitating legal migration, and the counterpart is greater cooperation with the countries with which we will establish these partnerships on preventing irregular migration and facilitating readmission where it has been identified. And of course, Frontex will be a very important partner in this axis of these new mobility partnerships. And it's perhaps no surprise that the countries that we will start with discussing the mobility partnerships are Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt. So as I said, the building blocks of our framework include the relations with the third countries. Now, the other key building blocks are, of course, border management, asylum, and immigration policy. And particularly in the area of border management, we have a number of instruments. We have, of course, the role that Frontex plays. We have the Schengen Border Code. And we do have financial resources to support member states' activities in these areas. If I can just sort of touch on some of the areas where we found that we've not been able to respond as quickly as we'd like, one of those has been the ability to mobilize additional finance, both for Frontex and indeed for member states in their own responses. It's a dilemma always in public administrations on how you have instruments which enable planning on the basis of risk analysis, of long-term needs, of clear objectives, and yet at the same time have the possibility to react very, very quickly. Now, I think we've shown in European Union terms that we're acting very quickly. I think everything's relative, and we recognize we're working in a democratic organization which we need the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers to agree to release additional funds for some of these issues. But in the case of Frontex, we're optimistic that we will get an agreement from the budgetary authority, the Parliament and the Council, to increase the resources available to Frontex to support the very important work that they've been doing, the mobilization they've shown in the southern Mediterranean region. Now, longer term, as the European Union is looking to the future financing, or more generally, of all of our activities right across all policy areas from 2014 onwards, we want to look also again there at how the funding can be made more strategic, how we can work more closely with the member states to agree a sort of a more general approach on what their objectives are, but then to make sure the funding is moving quickly and not tied too much to rigid formula which trap you, as we're seeing this year, on a prediction last year of what would be this year's needs, but of course this year has proved to be very difficult. So the crisis or the challenges that we're seeing in the southern Mediterranean, of course, primarily it is important that we establish functioning democracies, sound economies in those countries. It's in the interest of the people in that region, and of course it's in the principal interest of the European Union. But also this is an opportunity for us to look at the instruments that we have to manage these sort of crises, both from the point of view of our external policies and our internal policies, and to draw the lessons. And that's certainly something that we're doing in the European Union and particularly in the European Commission.
Thanks very much. Can I just ask you about this funding issue? I mean, assuming we lived in an ideal world and you had ample funding, what would be the key areas for which you think we would need to have the financial resources? You mentioned Frontex, but what other priorities would be top of your list? And maybe also, how long does it take at the moment to raise the funding so that we have that in the picture?
There are funding instruments that are there, and the ones that are particularly perhaps relevant to some of these issues are the External Borders Fund, but also, of course, the Return Fund, integration, and instruments to deal with refugees. So they need to be seen in a broader context. And to an extent, what the European Union is doing is making available to individual member states the various sources of funding, but to help them, each member state needs to have an integrated approach to these issues. And of course, the whole concept of European Union funding is an expression of solidarity. That very often the countries that are facing the biggest immediate challenges, particularly in border management, have those challenges not because of any inherent weakness of their capacity to manage their borders, but they are under particular pressure, but it's in the interest collectively of the European Union that those borders are well managed, but also it's in the interest of the European Union as well that people who come into the European Union legally and not legally are treated properly and in the respect of the fundamental values on which our union is based. We want to give the member states the capacity to make long-term plans, investments. We work on an annual basis at the moment, but within a context of multi-annual funding. We want to put that on a better footing for the next framework. But also within that to have some possibility for emergency funding. And there's always a trade-off. The bigger the reserve, you know, it's almost like with your own savings, if you, in your domestic budget, the bigger the amount you put away for the rainy day, the less you can actually use for normal planning. So that's going to be the dilemma, how much you keep to one side. But I think we've shown with the what's going to happen, we very much hope quickly with Frontex that we'll be able to mobilize funds quickly, and also more generally in response to some of the member states now who are facing particular difficulties on the borders of the southern Mediterranean. We're in negotiation with them on what their exact needs are. And very often their needs aren't necessarily going to be met by financing from the European Union. Obviously, the first thing they'll be doing is seeing how they can switch priorities. And within the funding programs we have with all of the member states, we're ready to look at them at how to switch the priorities.
Thank you very much. Agostino Miozzo, you have just been to Benghazi with Catherine Ashton. So we are dying to hear what was your reading of the situation and of the security sector requirements when it comes to border management, when it comes to police, when it comes to the army. What are the key areas where EU's assistance is desperately needed? And how difficult is it to work with the member states? I mean, you are managing director for crisis response at a relatively new institution which has just entered the scene. So how difficult are these institutional challenges for you?
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a good opportunity to share some even personal opinion. I'm relatively new, actually. I'm there since 5 months, and at the very beginning of this, of my experience in the EIS, I was facing with this new great crisis. You said before that we were not prepared to this revolution to which we are assisting today. We were not prepared. We were not prepared. The European Union was not prepared. The member states were not prepared. And in January and February, I was at the very beginning of my work, and I was assisting the reaction of the member states to the crisis. And I want to show you a couple of pictures, slides that I have prepared for you. If I can go, okay. This probably has nothing to do with the migration issue, but this is a picture of the complex situation that we are facing in Europe. As you see there, these are the travel advice that the member states were giving to the European citizen, to their citizen, facing during the crisis in Egypt. There is not a travel advice. There is not, let's say, a common indication to the European citizen on a specific crisis. And as you see, there are many indications. You can go to Cairo, you cannot go to Alexandria, you are allowed to go to the Red Sea. The travel advice, as we see here, is not only a pure indication to the tourist and how to move, when to move, it's a political sign. And these give you the evidence that we were not prepared, even for a political sign to our citizen, and through our citizen to the states, the country that were facing the emergency. Another picture that is it's far away, but it's even worse. The Japan crisis, the earthquake in Japan. You can see there the absolutely confused indication that we are giving. This is an important point. We have to work on this issue. Giving a travel advice is a political sign. We have to work, and keeping in mind that the assistance to the consular issue is a pure member state issue, but this is, as I said, a political sign. I will not go through the data that has been already presented by the HCR and the AOM, to whom I have to say, you have done a great, enormous work. I've never seen in my experience such a capacity to manage 800,000 people in a relatively short time frame in the way that you have managed. So thank you very much to the international community for the enormous work that you have done. And but just a few nothing, yeah, here. Just to tell you and share with you the efforts that the European system has done in terms of financing these huge efforts. 100 million, roughly 50 million by the European Union system, mainly through the eco funds and eco and civil protection, and 50 million from the member states. It's a huge amount of money that we put in these great efforts, but the efforts had a good result. I'm coming back. I was day before yesterday in Benghazi with Cathy Ashton, with the High Representative, and we met the local authorities, we met civil society, and I want to share with you some of the discussion that we had with President Jalil. He was presenting to Cathy Ashton, to the High Representative, three in synthesis, priority. The first one, Gaddafi has to go immediately, as soon as possible. The second priority, security sector reform. Security sector reform. They were insisting, this is the real future priority. We have to start today. Security sector means reorganize the border control, reorganize the police system, reorganize the defense. They don't have so far as a border control. If you cross the border from Egypt to Libya, you will stop in Saloun, that is the town that is on the Egyptian side. You have a perfect border control from the Egyptian side, and then you enter in the no man's land. You enter in the absolute vacuum of any kind of control, and we are at the border with Egypt. We have to imagine the southern border of this huge country with a desert border with other countries from where the massive irregular immigrants are obviously coming, and where they are afraid that Al-Qaeda elements obviously are moving, where any kind of movement, army and not only army, is really open. So security sector reform, and civil society. Information and support to the civil society. Support to the young generation. Support to these wonderful people that they discover now, today, that they are writing their own constitution. They are proud of their flag. They're proud of their country. They're proud today. Belinda, I agree totally on what you said at the beginning of your introduction. We should remember that 20 years ago, we were building a new Europe with some countries that were coming out from a long, very heavy, long history. Europe invested quite a lot in these countries, and we see the result. We have to invest quite a lot in the southern Mediterranean country if we want to see a new picture in 20 years, if we want to imagine Libya, Egypt, Tunisia in 20 years from now, as we are imagining the country where we are today in this interesting meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very genuine sense of developments in the region. Ilkka Laitinen, I mean, you must be happy that this huge challenge comes 6 years after Frontex was created, because we recalled last year at this time how you started with your private laptop and a group of people trying to manage the first operation in the Canary Islands. So at the moment, Frontex is a mature agency. There is still the legislative perfectioning which is going on. There is still a need for more funding. But from your perspective, how do you see the key elements such as third-party cooperation in the context of this crisis, such as the situational awareness and monitoring that Frontex is doing, and finally the interagency cooperation with other actors on the European scene?
Yes, thank you very much, Pavel. Good morning, all colleagues. First of all, I would like to salute all the border guards who are present here and who are working at the border in favor of our security and safety. Indeed, this situation in North Africa has unveiled many of the aspects that we have been able to see in the past, and some new aspects as well for the future. I remember the discussion 1 year ago here about the starting points of the agency, where we were, where we are heading, and now what we have learned today is that there are some relatively important steps that are to be taken in terms of the further development of Frontex. Belinda mentioned already the situation with the new Frontex regulation. There are certain aspects that certainly will intensify and strengthen the agency, and we are itching to learn the good news from Brussels that the agreement between the Council and the Parliament has been reached, and the new regulation will come into force. But this is not the whole story. You asked about the financing, and it was mentioned by other fellow speakers as well. For the time being, we are about to enter the debate on the next financial perspective as from 2014, and this is something which obviously will have an impact on all the policy sectors, including home affairs, including border security. And if we take a look to the past, when these multi-annual financial programs have been developed by the European Union, some more or less strategic decisions have been taken, and I think, and I have a feeling that this is the moment where border control would be among these things where really some strategic decisions would be taken. Of course, it requires a longer-term implementation on that. Seeing what is happening in terms of the functioning of Schengen system, seeing what is happening now in the North African case, how diverse, how complicated the situation is where we are working, and so on. I'm not to say what is happening, but I think the elements are in the air, and the moment is right to see on that. I would like to pay tribute to two organizations particularly which are present here, the UNHCR and the IOM. You have really done a marvelous job. It was very well depicted here where we are now in terms of North African, and I think the key word is the displaced people, these more than 800,000, which are to larger extent residing in Tunisia and to lesser extent in Egypt. And if we think about the readiness of these two countries, Tunisia and Egypt, taking into account what have happened recently in these countries, the level of the development of the infrastructure and the public administration, and they have to cope with almost 1 million people in the circumstances where they are, I think the European Union should be quite silent with these points. Another institution or organization that has done a very, very great job is the External Action Service and the crisis management mechanism, and Agostina said many words about that. But if we think about from the Frontex point of view, what lessons we have learned in this case. I think this has really shown all the aspects of the border control, the different levels of the maturity of border control. Agostino mentioned about what are the priorities of the Libyan authorities in the Benghazi region, is to establish the security system. And this is, as a rule, among the first steps is to establish border management system. This is a sort of cornerstone upon which the organizational public administration should be built on. So this is one experience that we have learned in this case. Then if we think about the situation that is crossing the Mediterranean Sea, to larger extent from Tunisia, which is now decreasing, certain flows from Libya, mainly of these third country nationals. I think we see the whole diversity of mixed flows. We cannot say that people from Tunisia are of that profile, or people that are coming from Libya are of that. And that is the daily bread of border guards, that have to face the mixed flows and being ready and being able to identify certain activities that we have to take. Those who are in need of international protection, we need to be able to identify these. We need to identify those people who might be linked into criminal activities. We need to have the information in order to identify the signals which might lead to terrorist activities. We need to stand ready to participate in maritime search and rescue operations. And all these aspects we have already seen in this North African situation. And if we expand the scale a bit, we should not only talk about the Mediterranean, because what we have seen in the past and our findings in the risk analysis and situational monitoring really tells us this, is that different routes are interlinked. What is happening in North Africa have an impact to the situation at the Turkish-Greek land border. And actually the first signs that we got that something is going to happen or would happen in Arab countries, we got last autumn during the operation between the Greek and Turkish land border. In the screenings and debriefing activities, there were signs. Of course, it's very easy to be wise afterwards if only we knew and if we could conclude that these are the signs that something, this kind of historical, is going to happen. But the fact is that we got first signs on that. So it is interlinked into that. Another feature is the Western African route affecting the Canary Islands. We must not disregard what is happening in Senegal, Mauritania, Ivory Coast, and that area. We have to consider this as a part of this puzzle. And that means that the response that we have been created based on the risk analysis and the situational monitoring and the different scenarios that we are developing and maintaining, we had to create a overall response package. And the good news was what we learned, that we got or about to get the extra funding, and that means that we have more than doubled the operational intensity from what was previously planned for 2011. The story is not over. We don't see the solution in Libya. We don't know what is going to happen in Syria, what is happening in other Arab countries, what would be the development in Egypt in terms of these religious clashes and so on. What about Morocco, Algeria? We simply do not know. So we have to stand ready for maintaining and developing different scenarios and different action plans. And keep in mind that when finally we talk about border control, the responsibility is with the member states. And in the case that there is a joint operation coordinated by Frontex. It has to be carried out with the consensus of member states. So there are certainly so many pieces in this puzzle that have to be fit to each other. And finally, if we think about now the perception and the pressure that we have, and I think, Agostino, you could also have the same feeling, that the European Union is acting in